So now we're on to potassium. So potassium, the serum potassium is very tightly regulated. You're going to hear me say that word a lot with electrolytes and with pH because of the symptoms and the harm it can cause in different organs when these electrolytes and acid gets out of whack. So most of the potassium is intracellular, which gives you that voltage across cells. It's the main cation that is intracellular, and the range is really 3.5 to 5. So as no, it's like everything. It's a spectrum. If it's 5.1, is it abnormal for you in school? Yes. If it's 3.4, is it too low for you in school? Yes. Um, is there going to be a major disturbance at that level? No. So in real life, a potassium of 6.5 or 7 becomes very concerning. Potassium of 2.5 or below, again, becomes concerning. And what's the concern? A heart. So if you see a low potassium, think heart arrhythmias. The heart, the conduction system of the heart and the contractions of the heart, and particularly the conduction system, gets very twitchy and irritable. The heart gets irritable and throws off. You can go into all kinds of dangerous rhythms with high potassium or low potassium, especially if you're on certain drugs such as digoxin that we'll come to later. So now not only do you have an electrolyte disturbance, but some of the drugs that we give for cardiac conditions can be magnified with changes in potassium. So what makes potassium go outside of its normal range? I mean, you could consume incredibly high levels of potassium in certain vegetables, but that's pretty hard to do. You could be on a number of medications that can elevate your potassium, such as potassium-sparing diuretics, aldosterone, ACE inhibitors. If you haven't heard of them, you will be in the next module. There's blood pressure medications, ACE inhibitors that can elevate your potassium. So drugs is definitely a group that we are careful with because of elevated potassium levels. The big one for the body is renal failure. So if your kidneys are failing for whatever reason, pre-renal or intrinsic renal failure or a post-renal obstruction, you're not getting rid of your body potassium and you can become hyperkalemic, and that can get you into a lot of trouble with cardiac arrhythmias. So the bottom two statements, potassium moves from extracellular fluid to intracellular fluid with insulin and stress. Okay, so what we're saying there is that there's certain hormones and there's certain conditions where potassium will shift from the extracellular to the intracellular fluid. So why would we care about that? Well, if someone has high potassium and I want to do something about it, I can give certain medications to move the potassium out of the serum on purpose to bring it down. So if somebody has an elevated potassium and I give them insulin, for example, I can shift it into their cells temporarily with the insulin to get them out of a dangerous situation with hyperkalemia. Another shift that takes place in the body. So sorry, back to insulin. So that's one of the treatments that we use for high potassium. I'll get to the complete treatment of high potassium at some point, but this is just an example of how we can move potassium if we have to with medications, insulin as an example. So the bottom sentence is talking about acidosis. So acidosis is when you have too much H plus in your body, in your bloodstream. And H plus is basically acid. It's the breakdown products of metabolism in your body. So your body's always trying to become acidotic. Does it usually become acidotic, meaning a pH of less than 7.35? No. Because your kidneys are regulating excretion of acids. So they're making sure that you don't become acidotic by getting rid of H plus. And there's other mechanisms in the body that we'll definitely get to that also control your pH, so your acid level, in a very narrow window of 7.35 to 7.45. So now, what is a mechanism of the body that can move potassium and H plus, or hydrogen ion? So there's a mechanism where if you become acidotic because your kidneys have failed, or your lungs have failed and there's acid building up, we'll come to the mechanisms of those, but there's acid building up in the bloodstream, in the serum. There's mechanisms with cells where the cells, the millions of cells in the body, will take the H plus out of the serum in exchange for a potassium into the serum. So there's a hydrogen potassium pump. So that's a way of hiding the acid in the cells in exchange for increasing serum potassium. Why do we care about that? Well, the body cares about that because that's a way to make sure that the body never becomes too acidotic. It trades off with potassium so that it can move some of the acid into the cells in exchange for potassium. There's other mechanisms. It'll make more sense a bit later, I hope. Okay, so still on potassium here. So what's the major cause of high potassium in the blood? Kidney failure. So a kidney that's gradually failing or acutely fails, hyperkalemia is a major concern. We will definitely check the potassium in someone who's showing signs of renal failure. And why do we care about potassium? Because a high serum potassium will, sure, it'll cause some confusion and maybe some weakness because of the neurological and the muscular system. But why do we really care about it? Because it's going to finally put someone into cardiac arrest. Severe, dangerous cardiac arrhythmias leading to cardiac arrest. So if we know that someone's on medications that can lead to high potassium, I mentioned spironolactone, I mentioned ACE inhibitors. We're very careful about telling them don't eat a lot of foods that are high in potassium, because you're already at risk of getting high potassium. Or someone who has kidney disease. Okay, you got to be careful with potassium. Your kidneys are already weak, so we don't want you consuming large amounts of potassium-rich foods. What about the opposite, hypokalemia? So a potassium of less than 3.5. So what's the most common cause? The most common cause is either some gastrointestinal losses, nausea, vomiting, well, not the nausea, but the vomiting and the diarrhea. They can be very rich in potassium, the fluids that you're losing. So you can become hypokalemic from them. The other very common one is diuretic use. So thiazide diuretics, loop diuretics, they drain you of basically all of your electrolytes: sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride. So hypokalemia with someone on a diuretic is extremely common. So if we see people on diuretics, we'll often check a potassium level and look at the same concerns. Not as concerning as high potassium, but definitely it's still cardiac arrhythmias, weak pulse. You can get muscle cramps. So if you look at the systems again, okay, the prominent system in potassium, heart. Are we seeing some GI in there a bit? Just a tiny bit. We're seeing some muscle cramps and some weakness. Definitely have that. So think of those four systems over and over again. Neurological, heart, muscle, and GI. What do we do for hypokalemia? Well, we can give them potassium supplements, orally or IV, or we just have them eat foods that are rich in potassium. Oranges or orange juice, very high in potassium. Bananas, not bad. Many citrus fruits, in fact, many fruits are high in potassium, and many meats are high in potassium because meat is basically just muscle cells, high in potassium. So cardiac action potential. Every action potential of any cell basically looks the same. It has the same overall mechanism. So here's this heart cell that's just sitting before the next stimulus comes along to cause it to depolarize. So what happens? Well, sodium rushes into the cell, and then finally at the top, at the peak, the sodium gates close. The calcium channels open, so calcium goes in a bit. So calcium is actually very important for cardiac contractility and cardiac contractions. So we'll come to that later. So calcium goes in a bit, and then you'll see that the potassium gates open. Potassium starts to go outside of the cardiac cells, making the voltage going back down, so repolarization, until you get back to a resting membrane potential. So it's all about sodium rushing in, some calcium coming in, and then potassium leaking out, and then the whole thing gets corrected by the sodium potassium pump that resets the whole system. And then the electrical depolarization will then lead to a contraction, a muscle contraction, which is in the end what you want from the heart. So the actin and myosin that overlaps, there'll be a contraction of the cardiac muscle. So I think ECGs in general, we're going to get to a bit in the next module, and then much more in fourth semester. But this diagram is really just to show that electrolyte changes, in particular potassium, will change the electrical activity, the nerve activity in the heart, and we will see it on the ECG, the electrocardiogram. So an example, and I don't think you need to memorize all these different U waves, but if you look at the top, that's just a normal ECG, and I'm not going to go into all the waves right now. Maybe in another module we'll get into that a bit more. But look at low potassium. So there's something called a T wave, and it's usually a nice rounded wave. You can see it in the top one. And look at the low, and the T wave is the part of the action potential which corresponds to repolarization of the ventricles. Look how tiny, look how small the T wave is in low potassium. So think of the T wave being built up with potassium under it. And when you have low potassium, the T wave is very shallow and small. Look at hyperkalemia and look at the T wave. It's tall, it's peaked, and again, if you think of potassium as living under the T wave, you'll remember that in high potassium states, and if you do with ECGs, the T wave will be tall and peaked. That's one of the first signs of hyperkalemia. There's many others, No need to go into them right now. That's for another time. So let's read this question together. A patient with an acid-base imbalance has an altered potassium level. The nurse recognizes that the potassium level is altered because A. Potassium is returned to the extracellular fluid when metabolic acidosis is corrected. Hyperkalemia. So B. Hyperkalemia causes an alkalosis that results in potassium being shifted into the cells. C. Acidosis causes hydrogen ions in the blood to be exchanged for potassium from the cells. And D. I'm not going to read D. So you just need to think about it. So these questions, or these answers, are extremely confusing to me. So let's just think of the mechanism, then you can find the answer. So I told you before that with an acid-base imbalance and an altered potassium, so there's a relationship between H+, which is acid, and potassium in the serum. And the body has to choose that if there becomes too much H+, acid in the blood, it has to decide on where to hide it, because acidosis in the system is extremely dangerous. Systems cannot work as the body becomes acidotic, and the system knows that. So what can the body do? So there's a number of mechanisms it can do that we'll get into detail as we do acid-base. But this question is saying, what's the body going to do with this acid-base imbalance? And it's usually acidosis. So lots of hydrogen ions are building up in the blood. Okay. One of the things it can do is it can trade off with potassium. So the cells all around the body, millions of cells, will say, I will accept a hydrogen ion into my cell if you're willing to take a potassium ion out of my cell to maintain the same charge. So the bloodstream puts H+ into cells temporarily and takes potassium out. So if you look at answer C, acidosis, so high H+ in the blood, causes hydrogen ions in the blood to be exchanged for potassium from the cells. That's exactly what the body does to hide the hydrogen ions in the cell, as opposed to being seen in the serum, because it's really the serum levels of electrolytes and acid that the organs and the body as a whole see. So there's the exchange. The answer is C. So let's talk about this a bit more. So there's some exchange that we spoke about where hydrogen ions can hide in cells, and potassium ions have to come out in exchange for the hydrogen ions. And okay, so let's see if we can just bring this a bit together with using an example of high potassium. So everything's fine one day, and suddenly someone's kidneys completely fail. And the biggest electrolyte concern that occurs is hyperkalemia. So their potassium has now climbed to 7.5, say. Well, we know that hyperkalemia at that level is very dangerous for cardiac arrhythmias. So what can we do if someone comes in with a potassium level of 7.5 from kidney failure? The kidneys are not getting rid of the potassium. So the serum potassium of 7.5, we need to lower it to below 5 to make it safe for the heart to continue pumping properly. So the first thing that we can do is I can give some insulin. So what does insulin do? Well, on a previous slide, we spoke about the fact that there's a channel in the cell membranes that when insulin is given, potassium goes into the cells with the insulin. Okay, so I can move potassium with insulin into the cells. That'll lower the serum potassium. What else can I do? Well, there's this system with hydrogen ions, H+. So if I can move hydrogen ions into the serum, into the interstitial fluid as well, potassium will go into the cell and exchange because they shift back and forth. So if I can move hydrogen out, I can move potassium in. How can I do that? Well, how about if I give something that's basic, that's going to pull the H plus out of the cells, and that's bicarbonate. So sodium bicarbonate, forget the sodium part, it's the bicarbonate, is going to neutralize the acid that's in the interstitial fluid. So it's going to pull hydrogen ions that are in the cells out. In exchange for that, it's going to move potassium into the cell. So that is also lowering overall potassium levels in the serum, which is what we care about. What else can we do? We can give the patient fluids with diuretics in it, like a loop diuretic. What's that going to do? Well, that's going to perfuse the kidneys, and the diuretic is going to stop sodium, potassium, chloride from being reabsorbed, and I'm going to get rid of potassium that way. So we already have 3 ways of lowering the potassium, 3 good ways of lowering the potassium. What else can I do? Well, there's a medication that you've probably heard of already. It's an inhaler. It comes as a nebulizer. It's called albuterol or salbutamol. And we know, and it's a beta agonist. And we know that when we give people salbutamol or albuterol, it works on the cell membrane, and it forces potassium into the cells. Another way to temporarily lower potassium levels. So we have insulin, we have bicarbonate, we have beta-2 agonists like albuterol, and we can also use diuretics to flush out the potassium into the urine.